Welcome to the Sussex Development Debates today. My name is Tom Tanner. I'm a fellow here at IDS in the climate change team. Very happy to have a distinguished panel here. It's good to see a full room, and welcome to everybody who's watching online as well. A little bit of housekeeping for internally. Please keep your phones on silent or off. If you need to leave, please go via the back door there. There's a lobby, because you can go around the back. If there's a fire, that is, these two are fire exits. Why are we here? I guess my introduction, I wrote a blog piece a few days ago just about some of my own preoccupations about the integration of climate change and development. And I guess that in summary, I've got this part of me that says that by focusing on climate change and particularly on the science, we're kind of missing some of the things we know that we could do anyway. Some of the answers we already have. We know that about how to reduce the underlying causes of why people are vulnerable to climate shocks and other shocks. And is the science just a distraction and getting in the way? And couldn't we just get on with enhancing access to services, rights claims, citizenship, land tenure, the kind of fundamentals? And the other half of me says, but what the science is telling us that this is pretty serious stuff. You know, the recent report on the implications of a 4-degree temperature rise for development tell me, no, hold on, this is actually really crucially important. So as part of that push and pull is there why we kind of set up today's meeting. Who's here? I'm very pleased to have a panel of Nicola from the LSE Grantham Institute, Kate Crowley, who's from CAFOD, the Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Advisor, Yvan Biot from the Department for International Development, and Emily Boyd from University of Reading. The plan is that we'll ask them to speak briefly, just for about 10 minutes each, to give an initial pitch, and then we'll open to the floor for brief, please, either comments or questions, and then we'll back and forth a bit with the panel and try to keep things relatively brief so that many of you can make comments. So, we should start by asking Yvan Biot from DFID to speak to you with his perspectives on whether climate change is a distraction for development or how to integrate it. He's currently the senior scientist in the office of the DFID Chief Scientific Advisor. So Yvan, over to you.
Thank you. I of course made a big mistake prior to coming here, and that was to read Tom's blog. And I just realized from what he just said that I probably misunderstood it entirely. So you might hear something fairly different from me on the basis of that. But let's jump in. Tom, in his blog, expresses his fears that a lot of action on climate change is going to threaten all the good work that we know about to promote development. That's the kind of main message that I read in what Tom had to say. He says that we are reintroducing technocratic approach to fomenting change, referring a bit to what he just talked about, science conducting what we do. He says that we are at risk of inventing new institutions and not using old institutions that we know work well, like social protection. And he also says that a lot of climate action is based on a simplified understanding of the policy action process, a simplified linear process, and doesn't really take account of the kind of political economy context within which decisions are being made. Now, these are genuine concerns, and I share them to a large extent with Tom. And it's the kind of concern and the kind of story that I've come to expect from an institution like IDS, which is very much focused on people-centered development and people-centered change. And so therefore it's very important for us to listen and to take this seriously. But the concerns that keep me occupied in my new job are very different from these, and probably exactly the opposite. And those concerns are to do with the fact that we have come to realize that we're not taking sufficient account in our core development program of climate change and then allied resource scarcity issues. So the story is, if you want, the opposite story. We feel that, we don't feel that climate change is necessarily going to threaten our development, but or climate change action is going to threaten development, but rather that we're not doing enough in our development work to take proper account of climate change and resource scarcity. And it would appear that we're ending up here with a tale of two narratives. A tale of a narrative by climate change practitioners, scientists, who are not taking proper account of development experiences and development processes and development theories on the one hand, and on the other hand, we seem to have a bunch of development people like DFID and probably my colleagues from civil society who feel that they're not taking enough account of climate change in their work. Now, fortunately, the world is much more complex than this apparent simple discourse between two narratives would point to. Let's look, for instance, at DFID. Most of the action in DFID, if not all of the action by the UK government to support international action on climate change is funded by the International Climate Fund. And the International Climate Fund is part of our overseas development assistance. And so therefore has to, by definition, by Parliament Act, it has to really be aimed at reducing poverty. So the very fact that our International Climate Fund is actually taken from overseas development aid guarantees to a large extent that much of what we do in our International Climate Fund, or through our International Climate Fund, is guided by the experiences we have in promoting development. You can see this in the kinds of actions we do, but you can also see this in the criteria that are used to appraise all of our ICF programs, and most of these criteria are to do with development outcomes. They have to do with numbers of people who are protected against the vagaries of climate. They are to do with numbers of people who have access to energy. They have to do with numbers of people whose livelihoods are protected against deforestation, and they are also criteria that have to do with numbers of jobs created. Looking a little bit beyond the ICF, as I have said before, much of what concerns us for the moment is not as much what it is we do through our climate fund, but rather the extent to which what we do through the remainder of our overseas development aid, the 92.5% of our ODA we do not spend on climate-specific action, how we can tailor it in such a way that it is that we make use of the opportunities in there and that we protect it against the risks from climate change. And it's an effort that we have engaged in over the last year or so. We have certainly engaged, including with Tom, over a number of years on this, but it's something where we have accelerated our efforts tremendously. Looking beyond the UK, at the international policy arena, I think that most of you will probably agree with me that the big show in town on the post-millennium goal debate and on the sustainable development goals is probably not going to fall into the trap of bringing in too much climate science and bringing in too much climate change action. The large consensus around the MDGs, not only by the high-level panel, but including by the majority of stakeholders across the world who have answered to the survey, is that really the post-millennium or the post-2015 goals should continue to be focused primarily on reducing poverty. And while sustainable development will be an important element in this and will probably have a higher narrative brought into it than it did in the original MDGs, it is unlikely that this will end up and that this will really distract the world's attention from its primary objective, which is to reduce poverty. So what do I conclude from my reading of Tom's blog? Are Tom's concerns that there is a big risk that climate change action will undo a lot of our good work on development? I think the concerns are genuine, and it is to IDS's credit that it continues to do research on this and demonstrates the dangers of this. But fortunately, I would say, the world out there, the real world beyond academics, is much more complex. And personally, I do not think that we run the risk of climate change overtaking the development efforts that we have been engaging in over the last 30, 40 years. What would concern me personally more is that much climate change action remains stuck in academic debate across disciplines and in academic debates about the role of climate science and the role of social sciences, and that not enough scientific efforts are being dedicated to demonstrating and researching what works and what doesn't in making a real change. So that as an initial statement from myself.
Thanks very much indeed. I shan't counter, I'll resist the temptation of sharing. Move instead to Emily Boyd. Dr. Emily Boyd from University of Reading, where she's a reader, and as a background, at least when I knew her in PhD days, lots of work in forestry and in the early days of the RED schemes. So.
Okay, so having said that, nice to meet you all, and I'm not going to talk about red forestry at all. I'm going to respond a little bit to Tom's blog as well, which was very provocative but also very interesting. And I would also say that I agree with Tom's point that we need to be considering the wider structural issues of political economies within which we're living. Fundamentally, climate change is about people, and it's about politics, and it's about finding ways in which we can bring development and the study of development thinking into the heart of the natural sciences and the climate sciences. So in a sense, I might disagree a little bit with Yvan that we should move beyond just debates within the academic community, because I do think that there is a role for social scientists and scientists to still debate and still try to move towards linking up much, much more. And I say, I think it's quite clear that with climate change, what climate change does, it exacerbates existing problems of poverty and vulnerability. And therefore, it's very difficult to operate in practice or in thinking about changes in human behaviours or changes in development thinking or any kind of social theories that we want to move forward on without thinking what that means under large-scale uncertainty under future climate changes. So it's forcing us as development thinkers to think, okay, what kind of new avenues, new tools, new approaches do we need to engage with? So for example, do we need to be thinking about experimentation and the lessons that have been learned about anticipating change, anticipatory governance, ideas from risk, for example, ideas about how you monitor and link that with risk thinking. You can think of tools that you might want to develop around scenario building, where you're actually bringing in people into forming narratives about the future, about climate change. I agree that some of the methods and approaches that exist, some of the quantitative hazards approaches, have their limitations. And I think even within those communities where they're developing those approaches, they could perhaps link more towards us and ask questions that are more pertinent, related, that we could answer, that we could address. Of course, you need baseline data, and you need the kind of data that these vulnerability maps, for example, offer, showing where transportation systems are going to go, and flood risk maps of coastal areas. But just doing that without actually bringing in people into discussions and debates in real ways is quite futile, ultimately, and very top-down. We have a lot of experience of that in development, and we can offer lessons on how not to do top-down thinking. I also think that there are communities within development studies, for example, urban studies communities, that can offer a lot of interesting new insight to the adaptation community, to the climate community, and they're starting to do that. We're starting to do that gradually, but we can do an awful lot more, bring an awful lot more thinking But I would also highlight that there are practical approaches that are being developed. So I'd say, for example, Practical Actions developed a very interesting vulnerability framework, Vulnerability 2, which tries to link together early warning, anticipatory thinking with markets and livelihoods, and trying to think about outcomes in terms of resilience. I think that we do lack novel approaches in the way we link science and policy. I think that we can go an awful lot better in asking questions about how the scientific method can help to inform policy, and how you build more experimental approaches, and how you link that with the kind of results-based approaches that Yvan is talking about. And again, I see some of my old lecturers in the audience, and they were teaching this kind of stuff to us 20 years ago about from farming systems research and systems perspectives, and I think there's an awful lot of knowledge that already exists there. But also new ways of thinking about futures and risks that need to be taken into account. I would say, yes, perhaps we are treating climate change as different, and we need to be thinking about more radical ways of working and thinking. But also we have to ask the question, what is radical, what's transformative for one person might be very different for another person or another group in society. So we have to be quite careful about that. I think that we also need to really take into account the limitations of the, let's say, the more neoliberal political economy. I agree with you in that regard, that most things within any organisation now, within any institution, is measured and has to be some kind of performance-related approach. So it requires therefore, some kind of middle ground in the sense of linking together different interests, different aspirations. But I also think that we can draw an awful lot on existing knowledge for moving forward. And I'll stop on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ask Nicola to give a brief overview as well. Nicola Ranger from LSE, London School of Economics. She's a Senior Research Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I should confess first that even though I'm at the LSE, I'm actually a climate scientist. And I would completely agree with Tom that there is far too much emphasis on climate science in adaptation planning. I think in terms of a balance of effort, funding for it's been completely off in the past. But what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes, and I feel guilty for having slides, is what is the balance between development and adaptation, and specifically, are they the same or are they different? So, as I'm sure most of you know, tendency, I think, to see that adaptation is just development in a more hostile climate, and this was another statement that Nick Stern, who is my boss at LSE, made. But I would argue that that's taking us down the wrong path. I'm going to argue that adaptation is actually a lot more than just development in a hostile climate, and even though we need to mainstream climate change into our core development planning, actually there are some specific and additional measures that we need to take to manage the very big risks that are out there from climate change. So I'm going to suggest that there are three unique challenges that come with climate change, which means that we need to take a new approach in the way that we manage risks. So first is the obvious one, that the climate risk is changing. So a lot of the decisions that we make today assume that the climate environment is the same. So for example, when they design flood defences, bridges, they don't take into account that the climate is changing. And what this means is that over time our society will become more and more vulnerable to climate. So I would argue that this means that we need to move towards a more forward-looking and long-term approach in the way that we manage risk. And there are two reasons for this. One is that for some types of decisions, so particularly over infrastructure, urban planning, land use planning, if we don't take account of that changing risk up front, it will be much more expensive and risky to try and retrofit those decisions down the line. So we need to look ahead. Also, if we only focus on the near term, we're just locking ourselves into decisions that could put us on a more vulnerable development path in the long run. So again, things like urban development, we're seeing a massive increase in the number of people living in cities. If we don't, at this point, make sure that they're building in ways that are resilient to climate, we're effectively locking ourselves in or committing ourselves to a much more risky environment in the future. The second challenge is that climate change is a much bigger and more rapid and potentially irreversible risk than we've seen before. And particularly when we're looking at now a situation where limiting to 2 degrees is looking increasingly remote, and we could be heading to a 3 or even 4 degree world. We need to start planning these are big decisions, big changes, potentially relocating people, changing at the structure of our economies that we really need to start thinking about now, because they will take a long time to do. So I would argue then that because of the nature of these risks, we need to be making a much more proactive and managing risks. And this is particularly something that we know from disaster risk management. We know that if we put money in to manage a risk, to reduce the risk before a disaster strikes, it's much cheaper to do it that way. And much more lives are saved that way. And when risk is increasing, it increases the economic and social pace for acting ahead of time. The final key challenge of climate change is that it's deeply uncertain. We don't know exactly what future we need to adapt to. And that means that we need a fundamental change in the way that we plan and develop. So we need to be more flexible, we need to get better at learning, we need to be more progressive in the way that we adapt. So rather than just taking a one-off choice about an investment, we need to make that investment in a way that it can be staggered over time. Now I think actually all of these things are pretty common sense. You know, it's pretty common sense to say, yes, we should look forward, yes, we should be more long-term, we should be more proactive. But these all raise some very fundamental challenges for development, which tends to be very short-term focused, very focused on immediate benefits. A lot of these measures, particularly adaptation in general, is seen as having very upfront costs, but very long-term and uncertain benefits. So we tend to give it a lower priority. It's a particular challenge for development funders like DFID, who, for example, their projects are 3 to 5 years in timescale, and they need to demonstrate impact within that 5 years. So there's a disincentive for them to act in this way. We also know from disaster risk management that at the moment we're failing to tackle long-term risks. Well, we're failing to tackle our current risks. We see a lot of improvements in the way that we're responding to disasters when they happen. But we're still not seeing a lot of action in terms of managing the risk before an event happens. And particularly, we're not tackling the underlying drivers of those risks, things like mismanaged urbanisation, rapid population growth. All these are increasing risks, and we're not really managing those risks ahead of time. So a lot of my research is focused on what do we do now? We have all these long-term existential risks, but what does that actually mean for the decisions that we make today? So I would argue that there are 3 key areas where we need to be taking action on climate change today. One is an area where we have very low regret benefits. So things that we can do today that are good in terms of managing our climate risks, but also are good if climate change didn't happen. And this is really where development fits in. So investing in better schools, better health systems, better public infrastructure, these are all helping us to manage climate risk, to reduce vulnerability to climate today and in the future, no matter what happens. The other important area is building the capacity for adaptation, both in terms of institutional capacity, individual capacities, research, And again, this is another area where development is really important in terms of building governance, stronger governance, building better institutions, building a better risk awareness. All of this is part of building capacity. But the final area that I think that we're really failing on is this acting to avoid long-term risks today. So acting in areas where the decisions we make today affect the risks that we face in the future. So again, it's things like infrastructure planning, where we really need to take into account those future risks, or it'll be much, much more expensive to retrofit them in the future. Urban planning, land use planning, decisions over sectoral development. And there's been a lot of studies looking at what development organisations are doing on adaptation, and these quite clearly show that they're doing a lot on the low threats benefits, but they're barely touching these long-term risks. So as you'd expect, they're taking decisions that will give them immediate benefits on their sort of 3 to 5 year timescales. But at the moment, they're really failing to tackle these long-term areas. And if we don't tackle those today, as I say, it will mean committing us to much bigger risks for organisations like DFID, much, much bigger expenditure in the long run. So just to sum up then, so I argue that adaptation is a lot more than just good development. In an ideal world, it would just be good development. But in the world, the reality that we live in, I think we need to focus on what additional things we need to do to manage these climate risks. And the key things are that our traditional development paths tend to lock us into more vulnerable futures. They tend to focus more and more people in hazard-prone areas in cities, more and more intensive agricultural techniques that might be more sensitive to climate. We also need a much more proactive approach to managing risks. We need a much greater emphasis on disaster risk reduction, for example, than traditional development gives it, a much greater emphasis on natural resource management. We need a number of specific and additional adaptation measures, things like retrofitting infrastructure. So just to sum up finally then, I agree that climate change, that we have focused too much on the science, and adaptation does need to be mainstreamed into development, but I'm concerned that if that mainstreaming means that we try to see them as the same thing, we're missing a big part of what adaptation is, and particularly this where we need to make a decision today that will manage the long-term risk.
Thanks very much, Nicola. We'll pass over to Kate Crowley, who works at CAFOD, working on disaster risk reduction, but very much with an eye for integrating disaster risk reduction, adaptation, and other risk concerns like conflict within a resilience framing. She has slides, but they're just photos. So the slides are very instructive, it's fine. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks. For those of you that don't know, and don't feel bad if you don't know, but CAFOD is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. It's quite a large development agency and humanitarian agency based in the UK, and we're part of the Caritas network, which is a very large network of agencies. We have a variety of projects. We're a partnership organisation, so we work with local civil society organisations on the ground, and we believe that it's important that we build their capacity so that one day we can leave that country altogether and they can continue working without our support. And that's our ideal goal. And I think today this debate is key. It's crucial because we're looking to the future, and we're also looking at current events now. It's not just all about the future. There are changes going on in the environment now, and the communities that we work with on the ground are facing these challenges every day. And I think it's important sometimes to take a step back and to just reconnect with the idea that for a community in Kenya, or where are we now, Bangladesh, they don't segregate their risks. They don't say, oh, this is climate change, or this is disaster risk reduction, or this is a livelihoods project. To them, this is about managing their everyday hazards, the things that are challenging them every day. And we, with our partners, help to try and move them towards a better future. So what we have started to change, and I guess what I'm going to speak to you very briefly about today is some of the changes that are going on in CAFOD, but also in other agencies in the humanitarian and development sector. We're changing the way that we work. It might be slightly slow for some people, it might be too slow, but we are challenging the way we work at the moment, because we have realised it's very clear that taking a sector-based approach to our programmes, so maybe having a programme on disaster risk reduction here, and a programme on livelihoods here, and then HIV and AIDS programme working over there, or indeed with the same community but different programme officers perhaps, it's not effective in helping people to build resilience. It's not effective for them, for the big picture that they see. And climate change adaptation is part of this big picture. And I think Yvan said that the real world is more complex, and I think you said fortunately the real world is more complex, and I thought, oh my goodness. For us, the complexity is the challenge. It's so complex and everything interacts. But sometimes you just have to reconnect with the people, and that's why I wanted to show you some photos of the people that we work with every day, because for them it's complex, but it's also simple. It's about looking forwards to, you know, what they need and the needs on the ground. And so, in terms of CAFOD's work, we are trying to take a more integrated approach. And this might seem a really obvious thing to do to a lot of you in the room who read about this all the time and study this and are thinking about development studies all the time. But we're going to take an integrated approach, and we, in our Horn and East Africa team, we are now having programs that combine disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation with livelihoods initiatives, alongside HIV work with the community, alongside advocacy and empowerment. And all of those things that basically mean that you have, well, in theory, have a more resilient community if you do it well and appropriately. If you look at resilient communities, well, communities that we believe are resilient already, they also have a really strong governance structure as well. And governance is key. And it's key for climate change adaptation as well, as you all probably know. And so, in turn, we also encourage our partners to work really closely with the local government unit, the national government, and make sure that what we do fits within the policies that already exist in that country. And that's absolutely crucial. And so what I'm leading to is that these big international frameworks, such as the Millennium Development Goals and the Kyoto Framework for Action, which is something that I personally am very involved, in terms of the NGO sector, very involved with pushing forwards our policy asks on. These international agreements, they're obviously, you know, up here, if you like, don't really sometimes connect down to the local level, which is a big problem in itself, and we have to try and move people's thinking on that. But it's the idea that the successes, and I think we've talked a lot about failures here, but there are a lot of successes and a lot of really great things that are happening. And just one example of that. The Kyoto Framework for Action, for those of you who don't know, is an international agreement for disaster risk reduction. It started in 2005 and it's up for renewal at the same time as the Millennium Development Goals. One of the things we're pushing very hard is to try and integrate climate change adaptation into that international framework. It's sort of there at the moment, but it's not clear and there aren't any goals, and there's same issues with the Millennium Goals, there aren't targets, it's not accountable. But the good thing that that's done is that certain countries around the world have been much more proactive in implementing disaster risk reduction policies at a national level. And these policies are slowly coming down to the local level. And an example is in the Philippines. In the Philippines, they have a DRR policy now, and they've allocated funding at a local level to implement disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. It's only a small amount of money, and it's only just starting to really be effective. We work in a community in southern Philippines, in Mindanao, and we've been working with the local government. And we were the people who told them about the HFA, the Kyoto Framework for Action. It didn't come down from the national government and the regional government like it was supposed to. It was us. And then they pushed back on it. And now they are implementing the budget accordingly at the local level with our civil society partners. So there is a lot of really great stuff happening, and I think we can be very negative, and we need to build on some of the work that we're doing. We are taking a different approach, and to help us do this, we have formed an interagency working group on resilience. And this is going to help us to think about how we connect disaster risk reduction thinking with climate change adaptation, conflict, just as Tom said, conflict sensitivity work, livelihoods, the whole suite of themes, if you like, that we tackle every day, that we work with every day. And this interagency working group is supported by DFID. It's come out of a long-term fund that we have from them. And we're working through various different things that are challenging us. And just so you know, these are the topical things that NGOs are talking about in terms of resilience. Complex settings. How can we do disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation work in conflict settings, for example? Areas that have huge problems in terms of governance and that are dangerous to work in. And that can be, you know, a big challenge in itself, in its own right. And they also have their own frameworks. So you have conflict frameworks that are separately from the DRR framework. So how can we sort of try and see the connections and bring those together? Organisational systems change, organisational change. So just like I said, CAFOD is changing, and many agencies are changing. We're trying to change the systems that we're sort of, you know, fit within to make it work better for the people that we're working with. So there's a subgroup looking at organisational change for resilience working. Measuring an impact. We've talked about measuring an impact here. This is key. This is so important. I mean, you were saying about the 3-year climate change adaptation and long-term sustainability, and we're very aware of that. And that's why we work long-term with partners. So CAFOD's been working in various countries for over 50 years now. But measuring the impact of resilience, which sometimes can be something quite intangible, then how do we do that? So we're working together to try and come up with some guidelines, some help, some indicators that we can test out in the field. So positively, things are really moving forwards. I think my last point is just to say that on the ground, when we're working with communities, whatever, you know, we don't say, oh, we're not going to deal with climate change because it's too uncertain. We deal with the changing environment. We deal with changing social systems on the ground. Change happens all the time. And uncertainty is definitely not an excuse for delaying action. We absolutely have to work with communities on the ground, and we have to try and encourage them to think long term, and we therefore have to think long term as well. But there are some really amazing examples, and I would encourage you all to look into agencies' websites, look at publications that are coming out at the moment. We're definitely moving forwards on a lot of issues that have conventionally been something maybe that's been held at sort of research institutional thinking. We're now linking much closer with academics. We're trying to integrate that into the practical work we do. And I haven't got time, but just behind me is a perfect example of an integrated program. This lady and her daughter are standing in front of a solar panel that is part of a water purification process, so that the salty water that they're drinking at the moment in Bangladesh, they can hopefully get slightly better quality water from this water purification system. And they're also involved in a DRR project as well within the community, hopefully preparing for flooding and cyclones as well. And it's part of a larger livelihoods project. So we're trying to bring all these ideas together. So, thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in there. Thank you. So I'm hearing to some extent that the counter to my concern, I suppose, about climate change swallowing the headline and our focus being on adaptation to climate hazards and the mitigation of greenhouse gases to the expense of development gains and thinking about the here and now. Yvan certainly countered that, arguing that if you look at the ICF, the International Climate Fund, it is predominantly focused on poverty reduction, that a lot of climate finance is counted as ODA, therefore it is tend to be directed at poverty. I guess Kate's example of integration suggests that it's very much all climate change is bound up in that development work. And Emily points out that actually a lot of the learning is from our existing understanding, from development studies, from practice around, for example, systems thinking, urban studies and so on. I guess my counter is that I still have this worry because, as Nicola points out, science does still tend to dominate. That does tend to push discourses around technology. And the end game for 2015, alongside the sustainable, the Millennium Development Goals or Sustainable Development Goals, and the Kyoto framework, is the UNFCCC and a new framework for action post 2015. Now, it's fronting the mega climate change fund, the Green Climate Fund, which, although it's not clear how it's being resourced, its governance framework is being established to get it's ready, up and running and ready to fit into that post-2015 agreement. And that will have a climate change front to it. It will have climate change goals, whether it be specific adaptation goals that make you have to adapt to climate change rather than just the current conditions, and mitigation goals that are focused on maximum reductions of greenhouse gases, not on the balance between sustainable development, of reducing greenhouse gases and development goals. So that still concerns me slightly, I guess. I'd like very much to open it to the floor and ask for comments and any questions potentially to the panel also, but feel free to just add a comment if you like. I don't like taking too many at once because it allows people to just conveniently forget comments that they don't want to discuss. So I'll take a couple at a time. Please keep them short, pithy, and then it means we can come back to you and find out your view of what the panel said. That's if anyone wants to. Please do speak up for the people online.
Okay, can you, right here. Can everybody hear me in the room as well? At the back of the room? Okay, so I'm Andy Newsham, I'm a climate change team research fellow. I'd like to thank all the panellists. I'd also like to thank all the efforts of our comms team to bring this together, which has been really fantastic. So thanks for that, guys. I guess following on from Tom's comments a little bit, I'm just still wondering about and this whole sort of moving away of refocusing on development and maybe pushing sustainable development down the agenda, as if you could have these two things as sort of separate, is a little bit concerning. And it was almost as if the elephant in the room, Emily mentioned it a little bit, was economic growth is the engine of all development. And climate change, in a way, not just getting in the way of development, but getting in the way of the broader environmental agenda, because it's such an oxygen-sucking kind of issue. I wonder if that's we're not talking about the fact that economic growth remains the big question. Can we do that long-term? Implications for climate change, implications for development. So I'm just wondering, I just wanted to bring it up, and I won't add too many things to that, but I'd like to come back to maybe Nicola's presentation and ask a couple of questions around, do we need to look at medium-term risk rather than long-term risk if we're going to avoid too much lock-in to pathways and not have enough flexibility? And try and ask you what percentage of what development does, the additional things that you talk about, would constitute. I mean, the classic sort of take on this is the McGray et al. Sort of pyramid of, not pyramid, the continuum of adaptation measures, where they basically say, well, most of it's development and a bit of it is actually additional. That's the tiny percentage of it, really. But when I debated that in a class that I teach, my students rejected that outright. So I'd like to ask you, what percentage do you think is of what we should be doing is the additional stuff, and what percentage is what we're already doing for better or for worse? If that makes sense.
I have a question from Twitter. Carl Jackson asks you, actually, Tom, what radical and behavioural approaches do you have in mind?
Shall I deal with that first? I guess I wrote that in because it seems to me that the debate is still largely one of tweaking the system. the green economy and the green growth debates are largely still not radical. They're about continuing the current system of production and consumption based around growth, economic growth, and use of natural resources in an unsustainable way. And those debates, they surface from time to time. But most recently, and I think most interestingly, in the debates around the Sustainable Development Goals, so within the MDG for post-2012 debates, creating a set of Sustainable Development Goals, which is very much being pushed by David Cameron and others in the UK government. But the push from developing countries is, that sounds great, we all sign up to them, and we can address the fact that a lot of the problems are caused by excessive consumption in the north. And so these goals, we're fine to have those, but it can't just be like MDGs. It can't be just about poverty in our countries. It has to be about consumption in the north and the south. And suddenly you get the kind of the rich nations backing away from this idea slightly. And I think that to me is that's the starting point for a radical approach, is just to re-engage the richer countries with these debates around the MDGs, because we are responsible for the structural controls that are driving excessive consumption, production, and the growth model. Can I let Nicola respond to Andy?
Yeah, in terms of what percentage, what I think that we should be doing is not trying to set a percentage. I think that's completely the wrong approach. I think we shouldn't be saying that 2% of development funding should go into adaptation specifically. I think that actually, so we need to do two things. One is about making sure the decisions we make today, where they need to, do account for climate change. So this was the points I was making about whenever we're investing in infrastructure, or we're investing in urban planning, or we're investing in sustainable agriculture, making sure that those decisions, where they're long-term and difficult to reverse, that they do take into account climate change to the extent that they need to. And then the other area is things that are sort of investments that we wouldn't be making in any other case. So I think that there just hasn't been enough work done. And this is about identifying where there are specific vulnerabilities to climate change, and then prioritising action on those. And I don't think enough work has been done to really say what percentage that's going to make up yet. It will be things like, for example, low-lying areas, particularly the small islands. That's an area where you definitely need to start working today. Areas where you might need to relocate populations because in the medium term agriculture could become unsustainable, or diversify the livelihoods out of agriculture. So these are sort of the big transformational changes. And I think people have only just recently started to really understand that those sort of transformational changes are going to be required. So that I don't think there's enough work in that area yet to really say how big that's going to be. And in terms of your question about medium term, so what's important is understanding how long the decision we make today will influence a particular community or a nation. So when I say long term, for infrastructure, a bridge will last, say, 100 years. So we need to think about the climate over that 100 years, say. Whereas for something like an agricultural strategy, that might only last for 10 years. So we need to think about that time scale. So the time scale you're interested in really depends on what decision you're trying to make.
Would the rest of the panel like to respond to either of those two questions?
Yeah, I'll respond to Andy. I think it's a really good point you're making, and I think that it brings back the sort of discussion around big D versus small d, and the fact that we sit here, we prescribe what should be in the optimal and additional, and then in many contexts, developing country contexts, people are actually just trying to deal with everyday difficulties, and they can't necessarily be thinking about the additional constantly. They're just dealing with the politics and the issues of poverty on an everyday basis, which is linked into economic growth, and which then is linked into green issues. So I think, when we're talking about being radical, I think revisiting a bit what sort of radical development actually means is really, really important. But I don't think that necessarily precludes linking in with climate science and other sciences, where we as a development community can actually move forward and say, this is what we want, this is what we need to address issues that we're dealing with, whether you're working in a local community in Maputo or a local government in Maputo, which is predominantly going to be driven by development needs and population growth and issues like that, maybe water scarcity and water issues, informal settlements and so on. But I think we also have a responsibility as a development community to be a bit more aggressive perhaps and say, okay, these are the issues that really are at the forefront of people's livelihoods, but from the climate sciences, this is what we need. And also, for the climate scientists, well, I agree with you, there's been an awful lot on climate impacts work till now, which maybe has been necessary. I think it's also a really good opportunity now for climate scientists to come and meet the development community. And it's not always an easy encounter, in a sense, because we're sort of sit within our communities and have our incentives and our structures that we're working with them. But I think it's an opportunity now to do that.
They're sitting right in front of us, the climate scientists.
Yvan? I'd like to take the question on what's additional and some of the examples that Nicola was referring to about some of the additional cost to infrastructure and so on, and link that a bit to what Tom was talking about. Some of the areas that where we have to start working. I mean, Nicola, you were talking about the small island states and so on, and I can think of the Nile, and I can think of the lower reaches of all these Himalayan rivers as well in Bangladesh and in parts of India. And so then I run a scenario as a government. Okay, what do I need to know before I'm starting to move 75 million people from the lower reaches of the Himalayan rivers in Bangladesh? What information do I need in order to decide what I'm going to do with the Nile Delta, and what am I going to do with the Nile Delta? And without some very hardcore science that will be very robust and incredibly rigorous and incredibly certain, I don't think that anybody would be in would have the political space to make any decision of that kind. So I think that some of the examples you mentioned, and there's a very nice example of this with the Thames Valley, where some very decent work was done in trying to find out what it is we might need to do about the Thames Valley. And a lot of science was thrown at this thing, and then they discovered that it was still too uncertain. And so therefore they couldn't make a decision, and what they've done is they have decided, well, we will make a decision then on that, and by then we will be able to make that kind of decision, and by that later stage, if this and that pans out, maybe then we're going to have to build some walls and whatever. So I think that if you start talking about the big issues, about those where some very important decisions are going to have to be made that go beyond maybe the mainstream and beyond the tweaking of our development models, we're going to really need some very, very decent hard science over and beyond some of the climate science that has been produced so far.
Any more responses from the floor? Well, we have plenty of climate scientists and academics and development practitioners experienced in country of working on climate issues.
I'm Hubert Schmitz. I work here at IDS, not on adaptation, but on mitigation issues. I'm enjoying this discussion, and I'm broadly in Nicola's camp, who emphasizes the need for transformation. I mean, what's new in the debate? What has climate change done to us at IDS? For me, it has emphasized two things. We need to give much more emphasis to speed and scale. It's about speeding up and scaling up. This is what is new. And I'm wondering whether we in the development research community have really tackled this one and focused on this one. Have we done historical research? Okay, what can we learn from historical examples where governments or alliances of actors have really tried to push things very fast and on a big scale? We know disaster stories, the Great Leap Forward, dreadful. But there are also some good stories, particularly coming from the transition economies. Have you really studied this? I think this is the sort of thing we need to do. It's about scaling up and speeding up. And I'm not sure that we have really tackled this. Instead, we are emphasizing, we have lots of reasons for being cautious, and Yvan is of course right, we need to be on firm grounds before we take big action. But that's for the scientists to do. Have we, as social scientists here in IDS, have we really tackled the question of speed and scale? And I'm not sure we have, because that is for me what is new. The rest is more or less a continuation of what we've done before. So, my question is, do you agree with this? Sorry.
I was just going to respond to what I was saying earlier, is that I think the development community can be more aggressive. Maybe aggressive is not the appropriate word, but confident to move forward and tackle some of these questions. And use existing tools that we have, but bring in new tools as well and new frameworks to do that. Absolutely, yeah. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
We do suffer from I'm a researcher at heart, so don't throw things at me. But I think putting my practitioner hat on, we suffer from new frameworks and new tools. There's a bit of a framework overload going on at the moment. If anyone Googles resilience framework, just duck, because it's unbelievable out there. And I think I still think that on the ground every day, that's where the change happens at the local level. And these international frameworks are fantastic if they get down to the local level, and inevitably, unfortunately, they don't. And that's the reality. And I think there's where we have a voice. There's where we can say, this is where we should be focusing. I genuinely believe that. You look at the HFA and it's only effective when it's actually got down to local level government and at the community level. And that's where we should be focusing, and that's where we should be shouting that this is where people are important and people have a voice. And if anyone's interested in this further, then I would very much recommend that you look at the Global Network for Civil Society Disaster Reduction. It's a bit of a mouthful, but they are championing the local civil society organisations, and they have formed a network, and they do research themselves into these initiatives, and they produce reports. And okay, maybe the robustness and the quality might be not to the standards that you're used to, but it's honest people saying honestly, the impact of these international frameworks on the ground. And I think that sometimes we have to look at that. But we struggle inevitably with measuring impact. So, how do we know that we're doing the right thing if we're not measuring the impact effectively? And it'd be great to have some ideas from the young, keen students.
And so, a point sort of building on Hugo's point and also responding to Yvan's point. So I think, so even where I talk about specific and additional adaptation, I don't think that we need to do it all today. So in some cases, it's about, as I said before in another framework,
Bring them on.
It's all about sort of working progressively towards managing these long-term risks. So we don't need to evacuate the Nile Basin today. But also we can't wait until the science gets to a point where they can say 100% this is what's going to happen. Because if we do need to make some sort of structural change at that kind of scale, it will take a long time to do. So I think it's about looking at what do we need to do today to leave our options open, that we can make these decisions in the future if we need to. So maybe it's about diversifying livelihoods now, building capacity now, so that we have the options in the future that when we get to the point where we need to make these big changes, we're ready for that and we're not locked into a particular pathway that we can't get out of. So again, I think we can't wait for the science is the key point. In some circumstances, we do need major changes, but we need to think about what's the progressive approach to building towards those big changes now. What do we need to do now, I think is the key thing.
I wonder as a researcher and development studies people in general, whether the answer to Hubert, there's this desire for the step changes and this more radical transformation at scale and at speed, we push back from, because we are naturally concerned about making some of the mistakes we've made before with, great leaps forward and so on. So where we see the potential for new seed varieties to tackle drought-prone conditions, we recoil about flooding markets with one particular seed and creating dependence tends to be our response. And I think you're right. Actually, are we looking to see where, first of all, where those successes have been, and secondly, where those of radical and rapid transformation, and secondly, what the levers have been? Because I suspect you probably don't agree with Kate's assertion that the levers for that radical transformation could be start at the community level.
And I do agree with her.
Okay.
I do agree with her. In fact, Kate seems to be, sorry, if I speak again. Kate seems to be suggesting that local is not compatible with big. The biggest transformations, economic transformations, have occurred in countries that have relied on bottom-up, decentralized approaches. China and Vietnam. This is not about the climate change field, but they've transformed. There's a lot to be learned there. And of course, they've transformed in the wrong direction, but nevertheless, there's a lot we can learn. And a lot is about policy experimentation. Trying something in one part of the country, which, if it succeeds, is then extrapolated in others. And it's a continuous learning from local experiments. So the local is not in contradiction to big and fast.
Question for Kate. I wanted to ask you what, in your experience, are the impediments for the translation of these impressive international frameworks into sort of local level action. And why I ask this particularly is because some of my own research on how this wonderful and sophisticated idea of resilience, I've been trying to study what happens to it when it meets really messy and ossified policy settings, such as my field site on the Indo-Nepal border. And I feel a lot of it is to do with a lack of understanding of local level political economic complexities. I don't know what your experience has shown you. Is it about knowledge gaps? Is it about political economy issues?
Forgive me if I just talk plainly without the jargon, because I'm not someone who deals with this type of research. So the political economy side, I'll just say what I think. The places where you've seen it work well are where there's a budget attached to it, where there's funding at the local level, specifically at the local level, for the local government to be able to do something. Inevitably, because we work with the poorest communities, and you could say that they're also the most vulnerable, they are also the government who is directly influencing those communities. If you take the really local level, when we speak to them, the thing is that they've got the enthusiasm, but they don't have the capacity. They don't necessarily have the human resources or the funding, the budget to actually do things. They rely on local civil society organisations to implement things that they know that they should be doing, and they support them if they can. I'm talking in countries where this is a reasonable relationship with the government. And, I'm not talking about where there's added complexity. So yeah, where it's worked, it's where there's a policy that's there for the local government, specifically written for the local government, where there's a budget allocated, and where there is participation from the civil society organisations on the ground, and that there's a participatory approach that's not even an approach that local governments normally take as a participatory approach, and that would go in contrast with what you were saying about maybe China and places like that, where change has happened, but maybe it's top down, you know, it's not necessarily participatory. But it's unbelievably context specific. I mean, that's one of the challenges we face all the time. We can't just have one general framework. We try, but it changes for each context.
Yeah.
But, sorry, come on.
Maybe I can push you a little more on that after the breaks up. But for example, some of my experience in India is different, where we've had these massive new federal level policy announcements, and a large number of zeros and many other figures are thrown at policy problems. Yet we see that an inability for these big sort of policies to translate into real benefit on the ground. I'm not sure if providing the budget is...
Yeah, I mean, it has to go hand in hand with capacity in terms of knowledge as well, and the knowledge and the ability to actually implement what is being asked to implement.
But I mean, what I was trying to challenge you on a little bit is, doesn't action on climate change necessarily challenge the status quo of what's happening at the local level? Doesn't it challenge entrenched systems of how things are done? And perhaps that is also why...
I'm sure it does in certain contexts, absolutely, absolutely. And you've got to throw in, you know, corruption at the local level and at the national level. You've got to throw in all of these very complicated issues, and they're probably extreme, you know, huge barriers standing in the way of local implementation. And there are, but it is context specific, and therefore it's difficult to make general comments. But absolutely, I mean, it is an incredibly complex setting. And at the local government level, you will have local people with their own local officials who have their own specific reasons why they're in that post they are, and their own specific ideas of what they should be doing. And that changes from culture to culture as well. And yeah. I'm very broadly saying that we should have a policy that goes down to the local level, and that should be supported by funding and the knowledge to be able to implement that. And those are broad things that we don't even have yet. So if we don't have that, then the challenge is enormous.
Any more? Final, Dominic.
Yeah, hi. I wonder, and I think this could be my lack of knowledge of development, if there's anything that development can take from climate change about uncertainty. Paul mentioned uncertainty, it's so inherent to the, within climate variability and change. And I just wanted to now Nicola gave really quite concrete ways of talking about risk, but let's be honest, we can't actually specify risk quite a lot of the time because of those huge uncertainties. I really liked what you said. And I just wonder, really, for the whole of you, does uncertainty bring something new to the pack, or is development really got that? Because I also hold Tom's concerns about new institutions taking over from ones that rightly or wrongly already exist. I'm not sure I phrased that particularly. Basically, what do you think about uncertainty?
I can give you a couple of interesting examples, I think, where we have supported adaptation action, and they're very different, the two examples that I'm going to use, and where we have, as development professionals, where we have learned something, and where things have changed to the better in terms of development. And I find this a very interesting experience. The first one is in China. In China, we have been supporting a policy research program over the last 4 years. It's a program called Adaptation to Climate Change in China program. And it's very sciencey driven. It does all the wrong things according to what this part of the world talks about. It starts with climate scenarios, and then it looks at impacts, and then it puts some confidence limits on these impacts, and it doesn't use any agent-based models, Dominic, unfortunately, but one day they will. And then they try and identify some adaptation options. And lo and behold, they met with all the expected problems that this kind of approach leads to. That it is very difficult, if you do this kind of top-down approach, it's very difficult for you to identify adaptation options. You still have to start looking at what people do now and build that one up and meet the two. And and so a second phase will look at that second element of it. But there was something that really impressed me in 2 states where this program has worked. What it has led to is to a realization by the state governments, or the provincial governments in China, and these are big governments. The majority of them are much bigger provinces than the whole of the UK together. And what this whole study has triggered is a realization by policymakers in those provinces that they have to take much better care of some of the natural resources that are potentially at risk. So it has risen awareness of the importance of water in the Ningxia province, much more than they used to in the past. It has risen awareness of the erosion problems and the desertification problems that are happening in part of that province. It also, interestingly, has thrown up an opportunity of potentially shifting agricultural potential and raising agricultural potential with increasing temperatures. And what's happening in that province is that some natural resource and agricultural policies are starting to shift in a direction of better care and potential use of opportunities. So I found a very interesting example. So it didn't lead to a strong national adaptation strategy or provincial adaptation strategy, but it did lead to a renewed effort to do much better land husbandry in that province. In Guangzhou, in another area in China, the town officials became suddenly aware of the increased risk of heat waves, and they suddenly became aware that actually they can do something about this. And so the whole town, the whole town policy making machine on health is now instituting a whole new regulatory system and new institutions to actually deal with current heat waves, how these affect workers, how these affect the poor, where these poor are in town, and how this might potentially shift into the future. So certainly these two examples in China from that kind of top-down drilling on adaptation has shown to me that actually some of some of our climate adaptation and climate change related action is starting to shift mindsets. It's starting to get people to look at things that we haven't looked at in the past and that we should have looked at in the past and that we could have looked at in the past to improve people's livelihoods now. The second example I want to show is not from a kind of top-down system, but it's very much a bottom-up system. And this is where in a scramble for possibilities of things to do that our ministers could be proud of a few years ago, we discovered, hey, we could do something with the Chores Livelihood Program in Bangladesh. And I'm sure that Tom knows a lot about this. And we could show this as an example of doing something where we can protect people against the impacts of future climate change. The Chores Livelihood Program is a program that tries to protect livelihood systems of people who live on sandbanks in the major rivers in Bangladesh that get flooded every now and then, and these people should never live there. But anyway, they do live there and they get flooded out and their livelihood systems get destroyed. And so in our search for things to do, we said, hey, why don't we raise the homesteads and the places where these people live? And lo and behold, this has in some situations, it has really made quite a significant change to the current livelihood opportunities of many of those people. And what it has done is in many places where people are now much better protected against those floods, they don't have to spend the money they earn every year to repair their homes, but they can invest it in improved homes. They can invest it in latrines. They can invest it in a boat to go and sell their produce or to buy their produce and get their kids to a better school, etc. So we have discovered, again, through this action, this climate adaptation related action, we've discovered that there are things we can do to deal with current climate problems that actually signify a very significant improvement to livelihood conditions of people. And that's something that we have learned in the development community. And I can quote quite a few more examples to do with early warning systems in Africa, early warning systems in South Asia, etc., where where actually our incipient work on climate change is making a change for the better now, and is probably going to put in motion things that will eventually lead to transformational change in the future.
I would add to that from the Choice Livelihood Programme example that actually that's kind of, Yvan's example is like dealing with the here and now and ignoring uncertainty because you're focusing on the current variability of the climate, so hey, it doesn't matter about the climate models. But actually there was quite a lot of soul searching within that programme, because part of it was investing in services for those areas. So building water, health, education, infrastructure in those areas, which are really dynamic. You know, they wash away on average, these chore islands wash away and re-emerge on average every 10 years. So you have a very dynamic environment. And obviously there's big questions for not only a donor but the national government of investing in these places where you might be maladapting. This might be a very risky place to adapt or to invest. Or it might attract people to stay there. And you know, that's a really bad idea because it's a terrible place to live. And you're making it more habitable, but yet the models are saying potentially it's going to become more flood prone and more dynamic. And there was a real difficulty to balance, but there's a development need now. These people aren't going to be moved off this land. They aren't likely to leave very soon, terribly soon. And so, you know, you have this future uncertainty, and you must say, let's ignore it, or let's live with the fact that we don't know if this is going to become more dynamic or less dynamic, or the floods are going to become worse or better. And part of me says that we do that very often in other fields, and in climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. It's often we retreat into the defence of, but we don't really understand, we don't really know, and therefore we shouldn't take action. Whereas, you know, we have the precautionary principle that says in the absence of uncertainty that shouldn't prevent us taking action. And in many other fields and areas, people just go ahead, you know. You just go ahead and take action. And so something makes me ask, in what situations can you have these leaps where you don't necessarily have perfect information and perfect evidence to take decisions to actually to take action? And so you deal with uncertainty by not necessarily trying to quantify it and create risk profiles.
I would just add to that, your point about has development done it all, or have they, you know, I would say no, not necessarily. I don't think any of us are saying that, but I think what social sciences and development can offer is understanding of human behaviour, social change, and really important insights, working together with climate scientists and other scientists in other fields to try and explore futures under uncertainty, and in maybe a bit more of a humble way, and also thinking about narratives and the kinds of technologies and approaches that are suitable and have meaning to people, which is linked to what Kate's doing. It's meaningful to people in context.
Thank you. Well, we shall leave it there. I'd like to join me in thanking Dr. Nicola Ranger, Kate Crowley, Yvan Biot, and to those online, goodbye. To those who are online, sorry, you might join us for drinks reception at the back. Do stay and chat further and have a glass of wine or juice. See you at the back. Thank you.